Rivers, happy Sabbath, everybody. It is good to see more of you here as we are all recovering from, it seems, the month of January, where everyone has been somewhat under the weather. Hopefully, I know we don't have quite everyone back yet. Hopefully, we can see you all back again soon. Are any of y'all familiar with the Dave Ramsey Show? By the giggles in the audience and the tentative hands raised, I imagine that most of you, I think, in this room are. But for those of you who are not aware, Dave Ramsey is a personal finance expert who has spent, at this point, I believe, over 3 decades teaching and giving advice to people on how to budget and, as he likes to put it, achieve financial peace, with a particular emphasis on avoiding debt and living within one's means. My wife and I have occasionally listened to some of the episodes or highlights of episodes where Ramsey receives calls from listeners of the show seeking financial guidance from Ramsey and his team at Ramsey Solutions. And we've done this just because it's both interesting to hear the kind of advice that he will give to people, and it's also intriguing to hear what kind of crazy financial situations people have managed to get themselves into. Now, I will have to admit, while the scenarios that some callers find themselves in are widely varied and frequently incredible, both in extremely positive ways and extremely negative ways, the overall advice given is relatively simple. Spend less than you make. However, with the abundance of options in purchasing on credit, many Americans find themselves racking up large piles of consumer debt out of seemingly small and innocuous purchases. For example, according to a 2017 study performed by Ramsey Solutions, 2/3 of Americans reported having consumer debt, and consumer debt is debt excluding what you might pay for a mortgage. So it's all other kinds of debt, with an average debt held of around $34,000 per person. Unfortunately, many of the callers on the Ramsey Show are unaware of their mounting debt until they find themselves in difficult financial situations. And since they have been unknowingly living outside their means for so long, they end up having to make some pretty dramatic life changes just to dig themselves out of the massive debts they have found themselves struggling to pay, especially as that interest on their debts continues to compound, and often at exorbitant rates. It is all too easy for Americans to spend more money than they have, but at low and easy monthly payments. Overall, the root of the problem seems to be a decline in financial literacy, and my wife and I have both concluded that we live amongst a generation that struggles to truly count the cost of their expenditures. Now, I'm sure that as I use that phrase, count the cost, you may be reminded of a particular requirement of discipleship that Jesus Christ told a multitude that was following him during the course of his ministry. And it's to that passage that I want to turn over to explore. So let's turn over to Luke 14, and we'll start in verse 25. So if you can turn over with me to Luke 24, we'll start reading in verse 25. Luke 24, I said 24, 14. Luke 14, 25. I apologize. Luke 14, 25 starts with, "Now great multitudes went with him. And he turned and said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. And for which of you, intending to build a tower, does not sit down first and count the cost, whether he has enough to finish it? Lest, after he has laid the foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, "This man began to build and was not able to finish." Or what king, going to make war against another king, does not sit down and first consider whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? Or else, while the other is still a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks conditions of peace. So likewise, whoever of you does not forsake all that he has cannot be my disciple. Now, the main point that Christ is making here is that being a follower of Christ requires sacrifice. We are dedicating ourselves to a way of life that is contrary to that of those who live around us. And so we may find ourselves having to sacrifice relationships, activities, and pursuits that we otherwise might like to pursue. So the idea, at least part of the idea, of counting the cost as a Christian means that we acknowledge following Christ will cost us something in this life, and we also likewise acknowledge that this cost is an investment in a future that is vastly more valuable than the value of what we put into it, and that, of course, is all thanks to the grace, glory, and mercy of God. However, is just acknowledging that we have some kind of price to pay the full meaning of counting the cost? I'm sure that there are a number of people who have called in to the Ramsey Show who thought that they had counted the cost of their purchases. For example, I'm sure that some callers thought they were counting the costs by looking at the monthly payment on that new luxury SUV or whatever else their heart desired, and thought, well, I can probably squeeze that into the monthly budget, without seeing the total impact of their purchase that it would have on their ability to save for emergencies or even their ability to retire. Is that really counting the cost? Or is there more work and attention that needs to be paid towards the act of counting the cost? Brethren, I believe that it is important for us to really understand what it means to count the cost, especially now in a world where costs and expenses are frequently a problem for tomorrow or preferably never. Why? Simply put, it's part of our calling. I believe that the instruction to be able to count the cost applies both to our physical lives and how we manage our households, as we can see discussed in the Proverbs and other wisdom writings, as well as how we manage our spiritual lives, and that's the spiritual aspect that I would primarily like to focus on today. So what does it fully mean to count the cost? Now, while we're here still in Luke 14, I want to drill down into the word count here, which is in verse 28. And I want to drill down into that word, which is the Greek word sephizo. And for those of you who enjoy Strong's Concordance, that would be Strong's G 5585. Used in this context, the word means to count with pebbles, or to compute, calculate, or reckon. To me, this gives an impression of a very detailed accounting and reasoning about the cost of an endeavor, particularly when used in the context of what Christ is saying in this passage. In this passage, the examples Christ gives are that of planning the precise cost into the future, giving an example of a man undertaking a large and lengthy building process, or a king leading a campaign composed of tens of thousands of soldiers and all the logistical challenges of leading such a force to victory. Here, I believe counting the cost implies a very careful accounting of not just being able to probably afford monthly payments on a new car, but a detailed budgeting and planning from the beginning of an endeavor to the end to ensure its success. Now, to further expound on what our calling is to counting the cost, I want to turn over to another parable that Christ gives over in Luke 12. And we'll start in verse 39. Luke 12 and verse 39. This parable, I think, is particularly relevant to our instruction to count the costs, as Christ is instructing us to be like the faithful servant as we all wait for the return of our Lord and Master. So that's Luke 12, verse 39. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. Then Peter said to him, Lord, do you speak this parable only to us or to all people? And the Lord said, Who then is that faithful and wise steward, whom his master will make ruler over his household, to give them their portion of food in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will make him ruler over all that he has. While the master was away, the servant was tasked with being a wise and faithful steward, doing the work of his master. So what really is a steward? It's not really a word we use commonly today, so I think it's worth defining in a little bit more detail as well. Now, the word used for steward here in verse 42 is Strong's G3623, oikoi amos, and which generally refers to the manager of a household or of household affairs. In particular, a manager or superintendent to whom the head of the house or the proprietor has entrusted the management of his affairs, the care of receipts and expenditures, and the duty of dealing out the proper portion to every servant and even to children who are not yet of age. Now, this steward was clearly a very detail-oriented role, and they had to be incredibly detail-oriented, as they were responsible and accountable for all of the expenses of the house, which could be a pretty daunting task in the case of a large household with many servants and many children who needed to all be paid and fed and have supplies bought for. The steward, like the example of the tower builder or the king in the examples that Christ gave over in Luke 14, needed to be able to count the costs in a very detailed way and be able to plan ahead so that all the affairs of the master's house would be well in order upon his eventual but unknown return date. All of those details needed to be in order at any given time as well, lest his master return unexpectedly and find that house in disarray. Brethren, counting the cost is a pretty important task, and one that requires great attention to detail. Not only do we know that we need to make some sacrifices in our lives, but we must account for those costs on a daily basis if we are to be prepared for Christ's return. What does this look like? Well, for example, we have to make relatively small daily investments of daily prayer and Bible study so that in our lives, so that we have the relationship with God that we need. Counting the cost could also potentially look like thinking in detail about what we might have to give up as Christ's return approaches, reading prophecies about the end times, and thinking about what kind of hardships might happen for us. We may want to think through how we would, or more particularly how we should, react to various hardships. Such exercises as these can help us prepare so that the huge costs or sacrifices don't arise completely unexpected and we find ourselves unprepared, like how an unforeseen building expense may cripple or completely end that building project. Like the tower builder in the example that Christ gave, we have to ensure that we have enough spiritual funds to complete our goal. In order to achieve our goal of being in God's family, we need to be good stewards of our time and efforts here on earth, allocating our energies appropriately so that we can afford the costs that Christ warned us that we would need to pay. We cannot fall into the same traps that we see others in our society fall into, where we find ourselves ignorant of how our time and money is being frittered away and being managed so that we get to the point of struggling to pay our debts. Rather, we must understand the importance and scope of counting our spiritual costs so that we too can be good and faithful stewards who God will make rulers over his household. Good Sabbath to you all.